It's taking a minute. There we go. All right, this is a soQuiet science session. We do these monthly-ish, and we're always excited to have misophonia researchers come and join us and share their work with us. A few housekeeping things real quick. Please keep your camera and your mic off if you can. If you can put yourselves on mute. And if you're on camera, please go ahead and turn off your cameras. This is to reduce unintentional activators that might happen during it. I want to make sure that nobody off in the corner, like, I don't know if you've been on a Zoom call, but there's sometimes somebody in some window off in the corner who's doing something triggering. So just to kind of cut down on that, if you can turn off your mics and your cameras. Please put questions in the chat. Michelle is going to be monitoring the chat. She's the real hero here. Hang on, I got to clear my throat. Let me put myself on mute. Okay, so any questions you have, put them in chat and we'll be sure to ask those. And also alert us to any issues. If one of us is doing something that is triggering, if my mic is too close, anything like that, please let us know. Michelle will be keeping an eye out and will let us know if there's something that we need to change. We're happy to do that. Feel free to use the closed captioning. Here in Google Meet, there's a button at the bottom of your screen below your window that has a box with a CC in it. That is for you. If you want to turn on transcripts, closed captioning transcripts that are automated, you're welcome to do that for yourself. Sometimes if my voice is disturbing or anything, you can just put the whole thing on mute and read what we're saying, which is kind of handy. Feel free to make use of that. And also this is being recorded. So you're being recorded, and we will post the video on our website and our YouTube channel in the next couple of days where you can watch it or share it. All right. A few things in addition to that. soQuiet is a nonprofit organization. We try to help out as much as we can with misophonia research. We do that through a variety of things. One of those is misophonia student research grants. So if you are a student, especially a graduate student who is interested in researching misophonia, we have money to give you. You can apply at soQuiet.org/grants. We also have the Misophonia Research Pool. This is the first independent, centralized misophonia research participant registry, which is kind of a mouthful, but this is where anybody can sign up for free and get alerted to any misophonia research that needs participants. In order for science to advance, there have to be people who can be studied, and this will keep you up to date on what research studies are looking for participants. And lastly, science sessions, which is what we're doing right now. This is, there's a lot of great misophonia research happening, a lot of papers being published every month on misophonia. It's a fascinating disorder that a lot of people are interested in learning more about. So there's new research coming out all the time. And not everybody is, I guess, finds it entertaining to read scientific papers. Sometimes they can be a little academic, but the information that is in them, we want to make sure that gets out to the general public. And so we're trying to bridge that gap between the science, the researchers, the academia, and the general public so that they know what we've learned. Our programs, all of our programs are free thanks to tax-deductible donations. Everything we do is thanks to our generous donors and volunteers and supporters. And if you would like to donate, you can always do that at soQuiet.org/donate, or you can text the word soQuiet to 53555 and donate through text. Technology. It's pretty wild. And lastly, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, something you like, something you would like to see, something you didn't like about this particular event, feel free to email us. I answer every email that comes in. I do my best to connect people with resources if they need them, but you can send it to hello@soQuiet.org. And lastly, we'll go ahead and begin. Let me unshare my screen. And today, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest. It is Solena Mednicoff from UNLV, University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about a quick introduction, Solena, Dr. Mednicoff.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and talk with all of you. My name is Solena Mednicoff, and I earned my PhD last year in 2021 from the University of California, Irvine, where I focused on cognitive differences between major and minor music processing and how that happens in the brain, basically. So my actual expertise is music perception and cognition. So yeah,
We'll
my
get more into
background
that.
actually,
Oh,
my
go
background
ahead.
actually, my background is actually like in musicianship, which is why I wanted to go pursue a PhD in neuroscience, where I studied how music affects the brain.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, we have a few questions I'm sure will come in about that. Tell us a little bit about, but before we get into the paper that you recently published, which Michelle will post a link to that here in a second. There's a lot more that came before that. So tell us a little bit about what kind of research you all typically do at the lab at UNLV, what things you're looking into just in general, and then we'll kind of parse that down to how you came across misophonia.
All right. Well, so the work that typically happens like in my lab at UNLV, well, I'm actually part of 2 labs at UNLV. So as part of my being a postdoctoral research fellow, so which is different from graduate work, different from being a professor, but that's a whole different side. It's a whole different side note. But the typical work that usually happens in these labs is actually developmental work and studying infants and kids all the way through adolescence, and how music can end up developing developing within their lives.
Gotcha. Which makes sense. Yeah, I can kind of see, having read your paper, I can kind of see how that is congruent to what we'll be getting into as far as misophonia. Tell us a little bit about how this paper came about. It's, I guess, first of all, how did this musicality and the research you all are doing on the neuroscience of music and music processing, how did you kind of connect that initially with misophonia and the result being this paper? Where did that kind of aha moment come from?
Ooh, so kind of thinking about it, if we take a step back and think about, well, what is misophonia? Misophonia, of course, it defines as literally the hatred of sounds, but it's much more complex than that. But if we think about it from like that perspective of the hatred of sounds, well, what can be a more positive sound than music? If you really think about it like that.
Mhm.
And so it kind of came about from thinking about like kind of like the sound sensitivity spectrum, whereas some people can kind of have this kind of heightened sensitivity to sounds, both negatively and also possibly positively as well. And
Mhm.
so, especially because a lot of people with misophonia seem to use music as a coping mechanism. And
Yes.
so, people who have misophonia might genuinely just have a heightened sensitivity of sounds, both positive and negative, which is why we're trying to tie in music and see whether or not people who have misophonia just generally have heightened sensitivity to all sounds in general.
Gotcha. Okay. And how did you, since those two things, I guess one of the things we'll get into later is there's a lot of musicians who have misophonia. I guess a lot of people who have misophonia are musicians. How did you first find out about misophonia? Awareness has grown quite a bit over the last few years, but originally it was not that well known. And in a lot of spheres, clinical or the general public, it's still kind of not well understood or known about at all. How did you first come across this term or this condition, and what made you interested in it?
So I actually came across this term before I heard about this project, and I heard about it, but I didn't really think much about it because unfortunately I don't actually experience it.
Mhm.
But I do think I have heightened sensitivity to positive sounds because of my involvement with music. And so when I heard about this project that my principal investigator is working on, I was like, I wanted to actually learn more from my expertise from music. So that's kind
Gotcha.
of what tied me into going into misophonia research, is kind of from the musical side of things and seeing like, oh, well, can we actually investigate this further and see whether or not misophonia has this relationship with musicality? Because my interest was, well, can we end up using music as medicine for this population down the line, or as a therapy?
It's a good question. Yeah, I guess a lot of people with misophonia do self-medicate with music with music. It's very common just to drown out triggering noises and as a relaxation tool, and there's a whole lot of that. Your paper is is kind of an assembly of current knowledge about misophonia. So it's a literature review, if I'm using the term correctly. My background is not in the sciences. My background is in theater, so I want to make sure I get this right. But you took a look at what we know about misophonia with specific focuses on the musicality element and also the age of onset. And the age of onset is something that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about that. It gets tossed around that it shows up in late childhood, early adolescence, and there's been a little bit of research into that, but there hasn't been really any in-depth research into it. Part of that is because there isn't a assessment for misophonia for children yet, although that might be in the works. How did you kind of make this? I don't know that I would have necessarily made that connection, but it kind of falls into place that misophonia, musicality, which I would like you to tell us what that means, because it's not necessarily music training or music talent, happening in childhood, and misophonia happening in childhood. How does that kind of fit together, and what did you find existed? And then we'll get into what you found doesn't yet exist and should be.
Of course, yes. And so I think that what you said is actually a very common issue that a lot of researchers have brought up now, especially within the consensus definition that finally came out last year, where many agree that the age of onset for misophonia happens at some point during adolescence. But I think a big piece of what is missing in misophonia research is when this actually happens, as well as why it actually happens. Because, okay, is it kind of like this on-off switch that just ends up happening for people where one day they just suddenly experience this misophonic reaction? And with that those anecdotal stories that you were talking about, where people just suddenly are reacting to that one person at the dinner table, chewing or eating, drinking, and then later down the line, it becomes this learned behavior and generalizes to others, not just that one person at the dinner table anymore. And so it's kind of like, okay, when does this actually become bigger, than just directed at one person and to many other people? When does this experience kind of grow in a way? Because it's like, okay, do people actually are people just predisposed with this experience and this sound sensitivity? Or do people learn about it, learn this behavior, and it gets worse over time?
Yeah, and or also, does it show up earlier than we think it does? It's just that kids aren't aware that it is an abnormal thing, or parents and adults aren't catching on to their behavior. That's all a mystery right now. We don't have any huge research on that.
Exactly. And at least from what I'm learning with developmental research and working with kids, is that kids do have a very tough time telling us how they're feeling inside.
Right. And since I experienced it, I guess I started my earliest memories of experiencing it, of having this, are elementary school. I remember having visual triggers in 4th grade. I think the auditory part happened before that. This was the early 80s, so this was not on anybody's radar as far as recognizing it or notating it or anything. And, I always thought that it was strange that other people weren't. I just thought it was weird that other people weren't as bothered by sounds as I was. Like, how can they focus on the teacher when there's this other thing going on? And it wasn't until I was an adult that I found the word misophonia. I know this probably would have been 2007, 2008. And I realized, oh, it's a thing. It's not just that I have, and so catching on to that, it would be tough for kids. And oftentimes it's also tough for adults to realize, oh, this is not just something weird in particular about myself. It's an actual disorder or condition or whatever it happens to be. And so noticing that is difficult, and I think it would be tough in kids. What other things did you find? You reviewed a lot of existing literature for this, and as I read through it, you notated what we know about misophonia, or what studies have shown about misophonia. I don't know if we can ever actually know things, because those things can be challenged and so forth. That's how science works. But you were looking for, and mentioned quite a few times, gaps in what we know. So you kind of go down a path of saying we understand these particular things about misophonia, but we don't have this part. And that happens a number of times. What were some of those major things that you found where you go, if somebody really wanted to do a study on misophonia, here's the 3 or 4 things that I would recommend that we need to find out next?
Well, I think one of them is what I just highlighted before is, can we actually figure out when this happens for people? Because most, as you were saying, for most people can remember having misophonia for as long as they can remember, and that's actually true in the samples of people with misophonia that we've collected as well, where most of them report saying that they've had misophonia for as long as they can remember, but can't actually nail down when it really truly first started happening.
Right.
So I think that's one of the biggest gaps, and something that we're hoping to actually do is this longitudinal work, because it's kind of one of those things that needs to happen to say, like, okay, we need to follow the same kids over time to see when this actually happens, and can we figure out why by following the trajectory of these same kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the tough things that we hear and experience as an organization is there is a lot of demand for answers about misophonia. There's a lot of people who are desperate for answers, myself and anybody else who has it. We know that there's research being done, and I think a tough part is being patient with that process. There's a lot of these things that take years, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to do the studies, and those things take time. If you can think of, are there any what I would call low-hanging fruit, like something that might be fairly easy for a researcher to research? It could be the early onset or even something simpler that you think might be the next step. What's something, if a grad student said, I've got, I need to do a thesis project, what would you recommend? And I want to do it about misophonia.
Actually, this was probably one of my other aha moments from writing this paper, was realizing out of the very few, there's okay, first of all, out of the questionnaires for misophonia, there's only a hand, like maybe not even a handful, even one or two that have been currently are trying to be validated right now. But there's even less for hyperacusis. And so what hyperacusis is also a decreased sound tolerance disorder like misophonia is, but hyperacusis is when you're having pain in response to a certain sound that might actually be really quiet to other people. And so you might experience that sound as being extremely loud and resulting in pain in your ears, in response to the sound. And so I guess my aha moment was realizing, wait, in these questionnaires, misophonia is never actually ruled out in the hyperacusis questionnaires. And likewise, hyperacusis is never ruled out in the misophonia questionnaires. And so there's, I guess, one of the low-hanging fruit is making sure that certain populations who might primarily be known to having hyperacusis is not actually having misophonia instead.
That's the challenge. Yeah, I think we talked about this on the last science session we did, which is it is difficult to, those are very separate disorders or conditions and things that people experience, but coming up with a questionnaire that can, I guess, not diagnose, but can assess one and not the other is difficult. And trying to get those for different populations, like a misophonia assessment for children would be I don't even know what that would look like. It seems like that would be a huge challenge to try to diagnose that in children, and get them to self-report in a way that is verifiable.
Exactly.
A few things, speaking of hyperacusis, a few things that you sort of introduce readers to, if they aren't familiar with it, are other conditions that I wasn't necessarily familiar with. I'd heard the words, but maybe you can kind of share that with our audience. One of them is frisson, which people may have heard that word, but you use that quite a bit in here. And tell us a little bit about misophonia, ASMR, which some people have probably heard of and maybe aren't as familiar with, and frisson. Those three you kind of talk about in tandem.
Yes. And so ASMR and frisson. So ASMR is autonomous sensory meridian response that some people may have, some people may not have. For example, I'm not somebody who experiences ASMR when I watch those videos. In fact, I might actually feel a little awkward watching those videos, and I just don't really like them in general. But some people with misophonia also absolutely love watching those videos. But there's also frisson, which can be thought of also as musical chills. So frisson is kind of those goosebumps or that teary-eyed feeling where you kind of feel like that big like explosion in your chest in response to any kind of music. And most people do experience frisson. But
Thanks,
most
Michelle.
but yeah, but also for ASMR, not many people actually experience ASMR as much as they do frisson, interestingly.
Interesting.
At
Yeah.
least from our samples that we've looked at.
Yeah, and it is always kind of fascinating because I find ASMR videos, and especially the audio part, to be very triggering. But a lot of people with misophonia do have an ASMR, the positive aspect of it. And I don't know that this is anecdotal, but a lot of people think of them as sort of two sides of the same coin. One is particular quiet sounds creating an elevated positive effect, a delight effect, and another is the misophonia reaction, which is panic or anger or whatever that happens to be. And I don't know if we've determined yet if there's kind of I know there's been a few studies on both of them, but we need a lot more research on, are they really just the brain taking that particular auditory input and saying, oh, for this person, they're going to hate that sound, or for this person, they're going to be elated by it. One question I did want to ask you that has come up a couple of times recently, and it's based mainly on a recent episode of the Misophonia podcast, where his guest was Lisa Loeb, the musician from the 90s. She talked about a fourth aspect of it, which is maybe a very heightened frisson, but kind of a trance or a euphoric or a hypnotic effect that music has on people that maybe is even to a different degree higher than that, where people feel like they go into, maybe trance is the word, but people feel like they go into a trance or they have a euphoric feeling that is very abnormal. Do you have any experience with that?
Okay, so I guess from a performer standpoint, yes, I do think I know what you're talking about, but also from like a music consumer standpoint as well. So I'll start from the music consumer standpoint, where kind of like that euphoric trance feeling might be actually experiencing live music, whereas you've maybe listened to your favorite song on the radio at home on your phone and whatnot, but then when you go to actually watch it live with thousands of other people, I think that's that trance euphoric state where you really just kind of feel in tune with everybody.
Yeah, it's something I hadn't thought about. That's a great point. And with my theater background, I made the connection between words like verisimilitude and catharsis that we talk a lot about in theater, which is the point of art is to make you feel that euphoric, bigger picture, overwhelming sensation or emotion. And maybe that is just the experience of art,
Right.
is a
And so
type of
now,
trance.
yes. And so I have a question for you from your theater state.
Oh, no.
From when you've performed, what did you ever kind of go into this kind of flow state where you just felt like you were just kind of performing and you knew what you was happening, but you were thinking about something else?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was really common. I don't claim to be an actor. I'm a director, designer guy, but I have done acting. And when I was in college, I had a couple of lead roles. And I remember one, it was Six Characters in Search of an Author, which is a famous absurdist play. And I played the director. And I remember coming off stage after each act and not remembering anything that just happened, having no clue how it went. I would ask people like, did I say all my lines? Did it go okay? And they were like, yeah, you were there. You were the one saying them. But it is like a trance state. It's hard to describe.
Yes. And so that's kind of also from the performer standpoint, that trance euphoric state that I think you're kind of describing, because I've also experienced that as a pianist when I've been performing in as well, where it's almost like an out of body experience.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the best way I can describe it, where I can actively think about what is happening all around me, but my body is able to still take on the keys and take on the keys and still perform. And so what neuroscientists call this state is the flow state. And
Oh.
both performers, musicians, as well as athletes can go into this state.
Hmm. And that's probably a bigger thing than just auditory processing. That sounds like I don't know, I'm not a researcher, but yeah, bigger, just our experiences of things. To kind of bring that back, I'm going off on tangents here. But
That's okay. That's okay.
when I try to describe a misophonic reaction to people, it's hard to get the right words. And I sometimes say you start experiencing reality a little bit differently. It's like if you've ever had a panic attack or anything like that, or experienced a euphoric state, then you know that you're aware that you're experiencing reality a little bit differently. And a misophonic reaction, if it's heightened, if it's a particular pronounced one, you're aware that your things have changed. It's like the world has shifted a little bit. And I don't know if maybe that is something that is kind of like this verisimilitude, flow state, trance. Maybe there's a lot more to it that we just don't know yet. But is that something that could be researched, do you think? I'm not even sure how you would do that.
That's actually a good question. Some people have actually started researching improvisation in fMRI, and so I think that would be one avenue that people could try to get into this type of flow state in order to study it.
That would be fascinating. I used to do improv performance. We're going off on theater somehow, but I started when I was in grad school. I started our improv comedy troupe, and we sometimes did improv drama, which is a different thing. But it's one of those, like, musicians, I'm sure, deal with this. But when you're on, and you do get into a state where it's just clicking, like things are happening as though they're supposed to, and you don't have to think about it. It's just, you know what the next right line is, even though you're improvising. And when a performance is not that way, it's also clear. You come off going, man, I was just floundering out there. What was I doing? But yeah, I guess the term is it's that flow state.
Yes. And so it's kind of like this kind of out of body state of mind, kind of like this trance where people know this is happening, but it's kind of like also in the back of your mind saying like, oh, I got this. But you have it all under control, but you're still kind of like observing yourself out of body in a way.
Right.
That's the best way I could describe it.
That's absolutely a good way of putting it. And you hope, I guess, when we're talking about catharsis in the Greek tragedy sense, catharsis literally means to vomit, but that's not what it means in the artistic sense. It means to have a purging of the soul in response to art. And you're hoping that state that you're talking about is also experienced by the observers.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's that communal art experience. I'll bring it back over to your study. This is what's great about these is that we kind of go off on chains of thought. Your paper points out a few areas that could use further research. One of them is the well-known concept of coping with misophonia through mimicry. And this is something that everybody who has misophonia has hopefully discovered for themselves. But if somebody is doing something triggering, if you also do that triggering thing, it alleviates or tamps down your reaction to it. This is partly, Michelle had posted some information on this, but the Kumar studies, which have come out, the motor basis for misophonia and the brain basis for misophonia, point out mirror neurons, where by us mimicking those kinds of things, our brains are satiated a little bit. You brought up this concept of mimicry in your paper, and the need for more research on it. Since then, there has been a paper that has come out about it called Mimicry and Misophonia, also overseen by Dr. Kumar. Tell us a little bit about your take on mimicry within what you study, musicality, and we'll get into what musicality is in a little bit more in just a second. But how does mimicry kind of fit into what your overarching goal of this paper was?
So mimicry, as I see it, is kind of actually very much in line it's a very similar coping mechanism for people with misophonia as music is. It's kind of like in a way to kind of mask or cover up the triggering sounds, especially since the study says that mimicry seems to be associated with the severity of misophonia symptoms. And so kind of seems very anecdotal, since mimicry, it's because it seems like mimicry can really just cover up the trigger, and it's not maybe thinking about mirror neurons in the sense that you might be thinking about them.
Right. Maybe it's distracting the brain too. It's not just a mirror neuron thing. Is that if that's kind of what you're saying? Anything that distracts us from a trigger can help too. At least in my experience, everybody experiences misophonia a little bit differently. One of the things that Lisa Loeb mentioned that I used to do and had kind of forgotten about it is she would put her finger in your ear and wiggle it around to make that noise. There's like an in-ear noise you can make to cover up
Oh,
sounds. I know that sounds weird, but I used to do that in
no.
school. And when she mentioned it, I thought, I used to do that, and here she does it as well. So that's not a mimicry thing, but
Huh.
it's a distracting the brain
Yes. And
signal.
I think something that another disorder that something like that can help, another auditory disorder actually, is tinnitus. And so tinnitus
Mm.
is this phantom ringing in the ear that cannot be traced to any kind of physical sound or related to any kind of physical sound. And so if you've ever experienced tinnitus, you hear this just kind of phantom ringing in your ear that just comes truly in the absence of any sound. So you might have this ringing in a lot of silence. And so for those people, like covering up and trying to just cover up that sound may help distract the brain. But I
Mm.
was looking up to see whether or not there was any other kind of auditory disorders that have used mimicry or use mimicry as a coping mechanism. And there is one study that actually was looking at trying to see if they can cover up tinnitus frequencies. So when the same frequency that people are hearing that ringing at, to see if they can mimic that frequency to cover up the actual tinnitus
Mm.
that people are experiencing. And they found that
Interesting.
people actually had a harder time trying to mask and cover up their tinnitus with that same tonal frequency. So they
Hmm.
actually had a tougher time just trying to just tune out their tinnitus, and they ended up focusing on both.
Wow. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
known people who've had tinnitus, and it sounds like it would be very stressful because it just doesn't go
Mhm.
away. It's like a sound inside of your head. Um, a couple of you mentioned, we've mentioned some other conditions or disorders, tinnitus, hyperacusis. One that I was not familiar with that you bring up several times, and maybe you can explain why it's correlated, is Williams syndrome.
Oh,
Maybe tell
yeah.
us a little bit about why that is in there, what it is, because I was unaware of it, and I'm still, other than the dictionary definition, very unaware of what it is. But you mentioned it several times. Why is that?
So I will want to say, preface right now, that I am not an expert in understanding people with Williams syndrome or this disorder, as well as autism spectrum disorder.
Okay.
Um, but so I do know that with Williams syndrome is a disorder that's caused by a certain deletion of a chromosome. And so people with Williams syndrome typically will have mild to moderate intellectual disabilities, visual spatial deficits. So they might have like not be able to understand like what things are out in space to themselves, as well as they have this hypersocial. But what's interesting, they also have this hypersocial ability where they want to be very social with other people. And kind of tying into that hypersocial ability is this attraction or fascination with music. And so people with Williams syndrome, they are very creative. And so not only with music, but also theater too. And so there's been some really good therapies for people with Williams syndrome with theater too. But
Interesting.
why we wanted to actually highlight both autism and Williams syndrome in our paper is that both disorders have this oversensitivity to sounds, in that they both simultaneously have aversions to specific sounds as well as this fascination to certain sounds. So they really like music, which is a very positive sound, but they also have these aversions, and like will have also panic attacks to the loudness of certain sounds as well. So
Hmm.
a lot of people, so I guess this kind of ties into what I was talking about earlier with hyperacusis, is that when I was reading a lot about Williams syndrome, is that people with Williams syndrome, they typically actually have aversions to sound. They don't typically have the symptom of actually responding to pain to certain sounds. And
Oh.
so an aversion to sound is actually a symptom of misophonia and not hyperacusis. So I
Hmm.
strongly believe that a lot of people with Williams syndrome may have been misdiagnosed with hyperacusis when they actually have misophonia.
There you go. Grad students, take note. There's a study in the works, ready, right, right off the shelf, ready for you to do. That's fascinating, actually. One of the things that you mentioned, creativity, and misophonia is, the more we learn about it, the more complicated it seems. In the early days, it was audiologists who discovered it and named it, and were kind of the front, the avant-garde, the front line of understanding it. It was seemed as being in the audiological sphere. And then that kind of expanded in the last 10 years to where psychologists sort of said, well, maybe there's a psychological aspect of it. It's not just auditory processing. There's a lot more to it as well. Our moods, the source, the context, all these kind of psychological things affect misophonia. And then in the last few years, it's become the neurological aspect of it has come into play, where we're doing brain scans of people with misophonia. We're finding how their brains respond differently. Our brains respond differently, and so on and on. And it's becoming more and more complex, so that fields anywhere from sociology, genetics, audiology, psychology, neurobiology, and on and on and on. How and now musicality, could be a part of that. Child development could be a part of that. How, as an outsider who's not a researcher, how do we study these conditions or disorders that traverse so many different specialized fields? And maybe this is kind of a vague question. Is it possible to really kind of home in on one aspect of it and study that specifically? I don't know if that made any sense, but it is complicated, and a lot of these conditions, whether it's even depression, something that traverses numerous fields. How do you study that, and how do you bring in others from other fields when you're studying something that is from the auditory standpoint? I don't know if that made sense, but it maybe so.
Yeah, it's what I'm hearing is you saying like, okay, how can we actually study this one thing that seems to be related to so many other different things and get people really actually wanting to study this one thing, even if they're studying many other things.
Right.
And the best way to get people motivated in working on this one common thing is collaboration and trying to work together all on this thing, and really motivating those like other people, saying like, this is important and this is why. Because people in different field in order to really progress any kind of science or research, you need that collaboration from many other people, many other fields, in order to really actually progress forward. Because if you kind of just stay in your own niche, you may not actually see the whole picture that we're trying to paint. And so here's one of my favorite analogies that I've learned about, like with science, is that science is kind of like this big picture, but we don't know what that picture actually is. And so every single researcher from every interdisciplinary field, every different field, so every researcher from audiology is trying to create this one puzzle piece. And they don't know what the puzzle actually looks like. And then this other researcher from psychology is creating this other puzzle piece. And then you have this other researcher from neuroscience who's creating this other puzzle piece. And we need to really all come together to try to see how each of these puzzle pieces actually fit together, so we can actually see what the bigger picture is being painted of.
Right. And I hear this mentioned quite a bit. I don't know if there's a more up-to-date term for it, but Dr. Johnson from the Misophonia Association and a variety of other people have compared misophonia right now to what's called the blind man's zoo, which is, if anybody's not familiar with that story, it's you have a bunch of people who cannot see, and they're taken to a zoo and shown an elephant, and they all take a different piece of the elephant in their hand. One takes the ear and says, oh, an elephant is just like a large leaf. And another person is like, no, they're holding the tail. Like, no, an elephant is like a branch of a tree. And so they're all holding onto a different part and seeing a different part of the elephant, but missing the whole picture, which is the elephant. And we're kind of in that place with misophonia, so that somebody who has a psychology training will look at it and go, oh, it's a psychological condition. And they're getting a little piece of it. And then somebody who is from another field will look at it and go, oh, no, this is obviously a neurological condition. And they're getting another facet of it instead of missing the whole thing. I think that's interesting in that, yes, we do all have to collaborate, especially researchers, but in understanding this from a sufferer point of view, we have to come at it and realize that there aren't any easy answers, and we're learning a lot more about how complicated it is. You talked about creativity. One of the things that I've always been fascinated by is that so many people in the misophonia community seem to be creative, artistically creative, whether that's visual art, writing, music. A lot of stand-up comics have misophonia. And so, I don't know if that's just me seeing it that way, because that's my background. I naturally look for people who are artistic, and I'm missing, it's a kind of a confirmation bias. I'm biased. I'm missing all the people who maybe aren't as prominent on Instagram because they're not posting their art and have misophonia. But how do you, as a researcher, try to account for being inclusive of people who maybe aren't in the known population of people? And what I mean by that is, suppose you were to do a study, and there may be no good answer to this. You're going to get a pool of people who are prone to want to be in studies. So you already have a sample that is kind of biased towards more outgoing people who maybe need that $15 and not the people who can sit at home. How do you account for that? Or is there a way to account for those people choosing themselves, self-selecting biases in research?
Yes. So that's an excellent question, because of course, like if you send out a survey, only the people who really enjoy taking surveys may end up responding.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's different ways that we can account for this, but there's no one best way. I want to really emphasize that, in the sense like so there's different ways that we can bring our data together. And so one thing that we currently have been doing is, and this is actually very similar across other universities, is most of our in-person sample is actually from the undergraduate population of whatever university you're doing the study at. And so a lot of these university students are offered not only monetary compensation, but also extra credit in their courses.
Oh.
And so these people are coming in because they're wanting that extra compensation. But when they do come in, they're not necessarily coming in because they want to actually be taking these studies. But sometimes they end up finding out, when this is something that we've saw over the course of this past year, running in-person study, seeing that people would come in and say, oh, I didn't know this thing that I had actually had a name.
Yes. And that's something we like seeing is the awareness of misophonia, whether it's being diagnosed. A number of studies have pointed out that they were testing people who were already in a hospital setting for another diagnosis, depression or whatever it happens to be, and then they find out. We love that aha moment where people realize, oh, this hatred of sounds, or this being very bothered by people eating around me, has a name. Michelle is raising her hand. Yes, Michelle, do we have some questions?
Yes, we have a question in the chat. And they said they're not sure if this is on topic, but it's a side topic they're wondering about. Is there any correlation between misophonia and early ear infections?
Ooh, that's a good question. I actually do not know the answer to that, because I actually haven't read anything that have made that association or have asked that question yet.
That is a fantastic question. Yeah.
Because I don't even think I've read in anecdotal case studies, people reporting an early ear infection, because usually that actually might lead to hearing loss rather than a decreased sound tolerance.
And since it's like a processing problem, that's why we're looking at it more neurologically now, right? So ear infection would probably damage the parts of the ear, but not the brain.
Yeah, it'd be more peripheral versus cognitive, as we would call it.
Yeah, I'm interested in finding that out too. I don't know the answer. Maybe after this, that's Jennifer Barish. I'll see if I can reach out to some of our audiologists and people who specialize in the mechanics of the ear and ask them. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Michelle, that we have? I don't think I've seen any.
Not yet.
Okay, thank you.
We just got another question.
Oh, there we go.
We did get another one. Do many people talk about hearing loss because they have listened to loud music to block out sounds?
Oh, to listen to loud music to block out sounds. Not for that reason, but yes, audiologists have talked about hearing loss just because of listening to loud music. This type of hearing loss typically is seen as what is called hidden hearing loss. It's something I actually do definitely experience, where you might be, say, you're in a crowd of people and you're trying to focus on that one person who's talking to you in front of you, but you just can't really make out what they're saying. That is what hidden hearing loss is, because you can still hear everything else. You just can't really parse out really focus on what that one person's saying.
Gotcha. Yeah, looking back, I'm 48, and so I want to tell anybody who's younger, take care of your hearing. I went to way too many small club show concerts in college and stood right next to the amps, and
It's okay.
I
That's
regret it.
that's my culprit as well, is too many
Yeah.
concerts.
One thing I did, I went to an audiologist, Dr. Kalmbach, who was a part of the Misophonia Association. She was my audiologist in Colorado, and she did point out something that I hadn't thought about before, which was a lot of people with misophonia will have white noise or brown noise or just kind of general noise always playing, either through headphones or through the little earpieces that they can get. And she said to not do that too much, or even wearing earplugs and constantly. And I'm kind of passing this along just in my anecdotal way, so take this with a grain of salt. I may not communicate it properly, but wearing earplugs a lot or having white noise in your ears a lot will make your ears actually more sensitive to sounds. So when you take them off or take the earplugs out, it might actually be making your problem a little bit worse, because now your brain is trying to compensate for its constant input and becoming more hypersensitive to sounds. I don't know if that's the case. Do you know anything about that?
I do know that, yes, it would make you more hypersensitive to sounds because your brain is trying to compensate hearing the outside world over, say, like just earplugs or that noise that you're using to mask that outside world. And so alternatively, that if you end up plugging your ears for too long, you might end up getting blockages that you might not want either. So that would also be another reason not to wear too many earplugs for too long, or headphones.
That's good advice. Yes, Michelle, more questions coming in.
It says, you mentioned listening to music as a coping mechanism as well as mimicry. Are there other coping mechanisms known to help that are notable?
It's a good question. I guess my personal experience, I don't know, Dr. Mednicoff, if you know of any coping mechanisms in addition to mimicry that you would point out. Everybody kind of comes up with their own, and this is my experience. Again, I'm not a physician or a clinician. I'm just a dude who has misophonia. Everybody kind of comes up with their own toolkit of what works best for them. And that can be anything from as needed wearing earplugs. It can include avoidance, which can become a problem. You can become very isolated, but maybe avoiding certain situations. Communication. If you're in a state where you can tell people about misophonia, a lot of times, not always, unfortunately, but a lot of times they'll say, oh yeah, I can stop doing this particular thing if they just learn about it. Everybody comes up with their own toolkit that works best for them. But Dr. Mednicoff, I don't know if you have any that you would kind of recommend as far as coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, like a lot of people come up with their own, but I actually just thought of another type of a headphone, because Angela, you said the over the ear headphones. There's actually another type of headphone. It's kind of like this bone that goes over your malleus bone. And so it doesn't actually go over your ears or inside of your ears, but you can still hear the noise and mask a lot of the outside world. And I think that using those types of headphones could be really promising.
Bone conduction headphones. I've heard a little bit
Yes.
about them, but yeah, I think it's something that needs to be. I'd like to try them out sometime. I haven't actually done it. A few more questions, Michelle.
Somebody asked, do you think music serves the same function as white noise? Could listening to too much music also increase symptom severity?
It depends on, I think, the headphones, honestly, because of, and like how much time you end up like listening to it. Because if you're listening to music, say, over speakers, I don't think it would increase symptom severity in the case that we've been talking about, in the sense of if your brain is trying to overcompensate and hear the outside world because you're covering it up with like headphones or earplugs.
Right.
So yes, if it's over speakers, I do think white noise can serve as the same function as music.
Good.
And then somebody said, what would you suggest then as a more sustainable alternative to listening to loud music or white noise?
I think those bone conduction headphones could be really promising, actually, because that way you could still listen to the loud music and white noise, but not have that possible detrimental effect just because of the type of headphones it is.
And one thing that I've done that other people I know have done is doubling up. So putting in earplugs and then putting headphones on over that. I know it's a little strange, but a lot of people with misophonia do that. So in a pinch, sometimes the combination can help, and then the earplugs are protecting you from the noise of the headphones, which are masking out the triggers. But that is something that I know people do. Any other questions, Michelle? I'm trying to read through them here real quick as well.
No, I think we got them all so far.
Okay, thanks. What's next, Dr. Mednicoff? So you have this paper that came out. It's a literature review that opens up a lot of questions, points out some deficiencies in what we understand, and opens the door for more research and ideas and the conversation on musicality and the age of onset of musicality and misophonia. What's next as far as what you'd like to look into?
Very good question. So you actually kind of hit on a lot of the things that we are currently working on and trying to work on next. And one of them is actually trying to develop a child version of a misophonia questionnaire to make it understandable for kids and make sure that the questions we are asking the kids are understood in the same way that adults understand the adult version of the misophonia questionnaire.
That would be a challenge. Yeah.
Yes. And so not only for developing it, but also validating it.
Right.
And
yeah.
so,
And it's great to be at that point where people are working on that. You know, I started experiencing misophonia in the 80s. And so it was 25 years before I found out it was a thing. And if we had that available to kids now, so that they wouldn't have to go through what a lot of us older misophones went through, would be phenomenal. I don't even know how you would do that. I think it would be kind of a challenge, or maybe it's easier than I thought. I don't know.
It is a challenge, but also working with other collaborators who have done this before, and actually we can do those side-to-side measurements of like, okay, if all of these kids answer this question in this way, what does it mean in the sense of like the adult's response in that way? And just kind of comparing each question by question to make sure like we're actually getting at the same thing and making sure the kids actually are trying to answer in the same way that adults are.
Gotcha. Yeah, that would make sense. And one of the things that I thought of, going back to maybe, I guess, a previous question as far as devices and so forth, and everybody has their preferred, sometimes it takes a little trial and error to find out which noise canceling headphones you like, and so forth. But there are people who are working on technological solutions to misophonia. And one of the things that has been, I guess, begun as far as interest in developing something like this is a device that is a programmable noise canceling device of some kind. So you could say, these are my triggers, here's what they sound like, and then the noise canceling part will specifically cancel out those specific sounds. We're a ways away from that happening, but I know I've talked to a few people who are interested in developing that.
That would be amazing, because it'd be both a microphone and the microphone input and the headphone in some sort of device that filters out the triggering sound.
Right, absolutely. I saw Dr. Jaffe. Welcome, Dr. Jaffe, by the way. She makes a really good point here that I want to bring up. Before this, we were talking about Dr. Davidenko and his team, Dr. Summerman, and they have really hit on the juxtaposition of visual information as it affects a misophonia trigger. So what we see, this is kind of why misophonia is considered a multisensory, not just an auditory processing condition, is that what we see when we're experiencing a misophonia trigger affects how bad the trigger is or how severe the trigger is. You can look up Dr. Davidenko's work. We did a science session with him previously. I won't go into it too much, but what Dr. Jaffe brings up very interestingly is we experienced this. My wife and I were at the store not too long ago. I hear a particular trigger, which I'm going to say, I know we try not to talk too much about triggers and say them specifically, but a particular trigger that I heard when we were shopping, and it sounded like, I'm going to say it, somebody popping their gum, a very common trigger. And I became instantly irate and just that panic kind of thing. Well, it was coming from a few aisles over. And when I went around the corner, I went to see who was making this ghastly popping noise. And it wasn't that at all. It was a stock person cutting the bands off of a box of produce, just, making a similar sound. And when I saw that, as Dr. Jaffe mentioned, my trigger was much more alleviated. Subconsciously, I knew A, it wasn't what I thought it was, and B, that it was going to be over because he only had like 2 or 3 bands to cut off. And so that really helped. And the sound itself didn't change at all. It was my visual perception of the source of the sound. So I think that's something we could research a lot as well, and I
Mhm.
think probably is coming up. If you haven't seen Dr. Davydenko's work, it's really fascinating. What they do is they take triggering sounds, but they match them with sounds that are with visuals, video visuals that are not that sound, and it's amazing how the same sound with different visual input really affects how me as a viewer of those videos or anybody else responds to them. Have you noticed anything
Like,
like that, Dr. Mednicoff, as far as in your work?
well, not necessarily in my work, but I have followed Dr. Davydenko's work, and what he's doing is this kind of illusion that a lot of neuroscientists know as the McGurk effect.
Mhm.
And I just never really thought of it as using it as like this therapeutic effect that could train people to realize, oh, this sound might not actually be what I'm actually thinking of it as.
Right.
So, kind of,
It is like a magic trick.
yes. And so it's kind of like, oh, is this so it really highlights like how real like this perception is and how it can lead to this emotional regulation, but how we can maybe change that trajectory of that emotion too.
Mhm. Absolutely. A couple of more questions here, and then we could probably go ahead and wrap up. This has been fascinating. I just happened to see this question, but Jennifer asks, have you found only hearing people have misophonia? That's a good
Wow.
question.
That is an excellent question that I need to be looking up later. Because
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Because I know that there is musokinesia, which is just kind of very similar, which is the visual part of misophonia, where you might have this hatred toward or like this type similar reaction to a repetitive movement. And so I wonder if people who don't have hearing have musokinesia.
Perhaps. One of the things that I had always wondered, and maybe there are people out there like this, but because the severity of misophonia is also dependent on the visual input we're receiving, like we just talked about in Dr. Davydenko and his team's work, I was wondering if there are people who have been visually, I don't know, have visual impairment or been legally blind or whatever the correct term for that is, have not been able to have any visual input since birth. If there's anybody who experiences misophonia severely who has never had the visual aspect of it as well, I don't know. Those things are all closely tied.
So these are two open questions as well that maybe some graduate students can investigate.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, I guess we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Michelle. A big round of applause. I'll do the silent applause so I don't trigger anybody, for providing a lot of great information, links, and definitions to what we've been talking about as we've been speaking. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Dr. Mednicoff. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your Sunday to share your work and answer some questions. And we're absolutely looking forward to what you're studying next. And it's greatly appreciated. It means the world to all of us with misophonia and who are interested in misophonia research that you have dedicated some of your time and expertise and all of that to studying this weird thing that we experience. And if anybody in the audience has any other questions after this, please let me know. You're welcome to contact me. I will try to answer them or find somebody who knows the answer if it's a particularly technical question. And so we're doing these science sessions hopefully monthly. Towards the end of the year, it didn't quite turn out that way, but we do these about monthly. We'll be doing another one next month. So keep your eyes peeled. We do have, I don't know if Michelle, do you have the link to the survey? We're doing a survey just on how all things went so we can judge whether people like this and it was beneficial to them or not. Thank you, Dr. Mednicoff. Absolutely appreciate it.
No, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate you inviting me and like being here and being able to talk with you guys all today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for all of the work that you and your lab do. And we look forward to more.
Of course. And if there's any other, I'm sorry, I bumped my microphone. If there's any other questions in the future, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share that. If there's any kind of papers and paywalls, please let me know. I'm also happy to share those.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday. Be careful.
All right. Thank you all again.
Thanks a bunch.
Thank you. Bye.